Rebecca Hayes stood in her father's office with rain hammering against the windows of the Pearl District loft. The kind of November rain that Portland sends in sheets so thick you can't see across the street. And she was holding a crowbar she'd found in the building superintendent's closet because the locksmith wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, and she needed to open the desk drawer that had been sealed shut for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. Her father had died 3 weeks ago, massive heart attack at 54, and she'd felt nothing at the funeral except the distant observation that she was watching a stranger being lowered into the ground, a man who'd abandoned her and her mother 23 years ago and had apparently lived out his solitary existence in this converted warehouse space, working as a freelance graphic designer, alone and unmourned, except by the handful of clients who'd sent tasteful condolence cards to an address Rebecca had only learned existed when the estate attorney called. But the sealed drawer bothered her, called to her with the particular insistence of a mystery that shouldn't matter, but somehow did. And as she wedged the crowbar into the gap and felt old wood beginning to splinter, she had no idea that what waited inside that desk would shatter every truth she'd built her life around, would rewrite her entire childhood, and would reveal that the man she'd spent 23 years hating had actually saved her life by breaking her heart. The office smelled like coffee and old paper and the particular mustiness that accumulates in spaces where single men live alone for decades without letting anyone in to disturb the careful ecosystem of solitude they've constructed. Rebecca had arrived that morning with boxes from U-Haul and a determination to clear out her father's possessions as quickly and emotionlessly as possible, to treat this like any other unpleasant task that needed completing, like cleaning out a hospital room after a patient had died, or sorting through donations at the Goodwill where she volunteered on weekends. She told herself during the drive from her northeast Portland apartment that David Hayes meant nothing to her, that he'd forfeited the right to be called father when he'd walked out on a 6-year-old girl and her mother without explanation or apology or even a forwarding address, and that whatever remained in this converted loft was just stuff, just objects, just the accumulated debris of a life that had intersected with hers only briefly before diverging completely. But standing here now, surrounded by her father's things, by the evidence of how he'd spent the 23 years since his disappearance, Rebecca felt something uncomfortable, stirring beneath the anger she'd carefully maintained since childhood. Something that looked unsettlingly like curiosity, like the first crack in armor she'd welded shut so long ago she'd forgotten it was armor rather than skin. The loft was spare and organized in a way that suggested either extreme discipline or profound loneliness, probably both, with a drafting table near the windows where her father had apparently done his design work, shelves lined with books about typography and visual communication, a small kitchen area that looked barely used, and a bedroom visible through a doorway that contained a single bed and a dresser and nothing else. No photographs on walls, no personal mementos, no indication that anyone lived here except as a function rather than a presence. The sealed drawer was part of a vintage oak desk positioned against the brick wall, the kind of heavy furniture that suggested permanence, investment, the intention to stay in one place long enough that moving it would be a significant undertaking. Rebecca had discovered it was sealed only when she'd tried to open it, had found that someone had driven thin, finishing nails through the drawer front into the frame, deliberately preventing it from being opened, and she'd stood there for 10 minutes trying to understand why anyone would seal a desk drawer shut. What could possibly be inside that required this level of protection or concealment? The estate attorney, a tired woman in her 60s named Patricia Vance, had mentioned during their brief meeting that David Hayes had left no safety deposit box, no storage unit, no hidden accounts or secret properties, just this loft and its contents and a bank account containing exactly $12,000, barely enough to cover the funeral and legal fees. The crowbar bit into wood thud, with a sound like breaking bones, and Rebecca felt sweat on her palms, despite the November cold, seeping through single-pane windows, and she wondered why her hands were shaking, why this felt like violation rather than simple property management, why some part of her brain was screaming to stop, to leave the drawer sealed, to walk away from whatever her father had locked away here. She'd spent her entire childhood asking her mother about him, about why he'd left, about what she'd done wrong to make him stop loving her, and her mother had always given the same answer in the same flat voice, drained of all emotion. Your father made choices, Rebecca, and we have to live with them. No elaboration, no context, no explanation that made sense to a little girl who just wanted to understand why her daddy had disappeared like smoke, like he'd never existed at all, except in the few hazy memories she had of being carried on his shoulders, of his laugh that sounded like thunder, of the way he used to call her his little warrior when she refused to give up on puzzles or building blocks or any challenge she set herself. The drawer finally gave way with a crack that echoed through the empty loft, and Rebecca pulled it open with hands that trembled harder now. And inside, she found not one object, but many, found a collection of things that made no immediate sense, that seemed to belong to different stories or different lives. There were file folders, thick ones bound with rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. There were photographs in a manila envelope. There were stacks of letters in her father's handwriting, addressed to Rebecca Hayes at various addresses she'd lived at over the years, all of them marked return to sender or not at this address. And there was a small handgun, unloaded, that made her step back instinctively, even though she worked in an emergency room and had seen weapons before, had treated their victims, had learned to maintain professional distance from violence. But beneath all of this, bolted to the bottom of the drawer, with screws that looked industrial strength, was a metal box, maybe 8 inches square, with a combination lock that suggested whatever was inside represented the real secret, the actual truth her father had been protecting. And if stories like this speak to you in any way, make sure to subscribe now, because every narrative here hides a truth no one sees coming, and I want you with me for every revelation. Rebecca sat down on the hardwood floor with her back against the desk, the metal box in her lap, and she tried to think what combination her father might have used, what numbers would have meant enough to him to serve as the key to whatever he'd locked away. She tried her birthday, 0312 December 3rd, and the lock didn't budge. She tried her mother's birthday, tried what she remembered as their old address, tried random combinations while rain continued its assault on the windows and the afternoon light began fading toward evening. She was about to give up, about to call a locksmith despite the cost, when she remembered something from early childhood, a fragment of memory so old she wasn't sure if it was real or constructed from photographs or stories she'd been told. Her father, teaching her to count, making a game of it, always ending with the numbers 4, 2, 7, emphasizing them like they were magic, like they were a spell that could unlock something important. She tried 427, and the lock opened with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet loft, and Rebecca held her breath as she lifted the lid, as she prepared to see whatever her father had protected behind combination locks and sealed drawers and 23 years of silence. Inside were more documents, official ones with government seals, and photographs of her at various ages that she'd never seen before, photos that must have been taken from a distance, from hiding, and letters in her father's handwriting, dozens of them, each one marked with a date and her age at the time. And as Rebecca began to read the first letter, as she processed the heading that said, "To my daughter on your 7th birthday," she felt the floor tilt beneath her, felt reality beginning to shift in ways that would change everything she thought she understood about her childhood, about her mother's bitterness, about the man who'd supposedly abandoned them but had apparently been writing letters to her every year, letters she'd never received. letters that suggested a story completely different from the one she'd been told. The documents beneath the letters made even less sense initially. Forms from something called the United States Marshals Service Witness Security Program, and Rebecca's nursing training kicked in, the part of her brain that stayed calm during emergencies, that processed information methodically even when chaos erupted around her. She read through pages of legal language, through references to testimony and protection and relocation, and slowly, impossibly, a different narrative began forming. A story where her father hadn't abandoned them at all, but had disappeared for reasons that had nothing to do with love or its absence, and everything to do with survival, with protection, with choices that destroyed families to save lives. There was a photograph in the box. Her father, much younger, maybe 25, standing with two other men outside what looked like a warehouse, and someone had drawn red X marks over the faces of the other two men, and there was a date on the back, 1998, 3 years before Rebecca was born. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and Googled the date and Portland and warehouse and murder, and the search results made her stomach drop, made the room seem to tilt and spin, because there had been murders, plural, a double homicide connected to drug trafficking, to a cartel moving product through Pacific Northwest ports, and the case had gone unsolved for years until a witness had finally come forward, had testified in federal court, had helped convict 7 men in what prosecutors had called the largest drug operation in Oregon history. The witness's name had never been made public, protection protocols, but the trial had concluded in early 2002, just months before her father had disappeared from her life, just before David Hayes had walked out of their house one morning and never come back, leaving behind a 6-year-old daughter who would spend the next 2 decades believing she hadn't been loved enough to stay for. Rebecca looked at the documents again, at the official seals and the bureaucratic language, at the photographs of herself that her father must have taken from a distance over the years, watching her grow up from whatever safe house or relocated city or new identity the marshals had given him, and she understood with a clarity that felt like ice water that her father hadn't left because he'd stopped loving her. He'd left because loving her meant keeping her safe, meant protecting her from people who would have used her to punish him for testifying, for breaking the code, for choosing justice over loyalty to men who killed without conscience. She'd spent 23 years hating him, and he'd spent 23 years loving her from a distance he couldn't close without putting her in danger. And Rebecca pulled her knees up to her chest there on the floor of his empty loft and cried for the first time since the attorney had called to tell her David Hayes was dead. Cried not from grief for a stranger, but from the devastating understanding that her entire childhood had been built on a misunderstanding, on a mother's choice to hide. Truth behind bitterness, on a father's sacrifice that had cost him everything, including his daughter's love. Rebecca sat on that floor until her legs went numb, and the rain outside had softened to drizzle, and the streetlights along 13th Avenue began flickering to life, casting amber pools across wet pavement 3 stories below, and she read through every letter her father had written, 23 of them, one for each birthday she'd celebrated without him. The early ones were simple, written in the careful language you'd use with a small child, telling her about a bird he'd seen that morning or a book he thought she'd like, always ending with variations of "I love you, little warrior, more than you'll ever know. Indeed." The later letters grew more complex as she aged in his imagination, addressing the teenager she'd become, the young woman she'd grown into, and it was clear from the writing that he'd been following her life somehow, knew about her decision to become a nurse, knew about her volunteer work, knew she'd chosen pediatrics because she wanted to help kids who couldn't help themselves. He wrote about watching her from a distance at her high school graduation, about how proud he'd been, even though he couldn't approach, couldn't risk exposing her to the danger that would follow if anyone knew she mattered to him. He wrote about the agony of seeing her mother tell her lies, seeing Rebecca grow up believing abandonment rather than understanding sacrifice, but that he'd agreed to the deception because the marshals had insisted that clean breaks were safer. That ambiguity created vulnerability, that if Rebecca truly believed he'd abandoned her, then she wouldn't look for him, wouldn't accidentally lead dangerous people back to the man who'd helped put their organization behind bars. He wrote that he'd wanted to contest it, wanted to demand some form of contact, but that his handler had shown him photographs of what happened to the families of informants who got careless, who prioritized their own emotional needs over protocol, and David Hayes had looked at those crime scene photos and chosen his daughter's safety over his daughter's love. The last letter was dated 3 months ago, written for her 30th birthday that wouldn't arrive until next March, and in it her father acknowledged that he was dying, that his heart was failing in ways medication couldn't fix, and that he'd made arrangements with his attorney to ensure Rebecca inherited the loft and its contents after his death. He wrote that he'd violated protocol by keeping these letters, by maintaining these files, by holding on to evidence of who he'd been before witness protection, but that he couldn't bear the thought of dying without her knowing the truth, without her understanding that every day of silence had been an act of love rather than indifference. He wrote that he hoped someday she'd forgive him for letting her believe the worst, that she'd understand the impossible mathematics of parenthood, where protecting your child sometimes meant becoming the villain in their story. And he signed it the same way he'd signed every letter, "Your father, watching over you always, loving you more than breath." Rebecca folded the letters carefully and placed them back in the metal box, and she looked around the loft with different eyes now, seeing not loneliness, but vigilance, not emptiness, but discipline, not abandonment, but sacrifice stretched across 2 decades. She stood and walked to the windows, looked out over the Pearl District, where young professionals and artists and tech workers moved through their Friday evening rituals, heading to restaurants and bars and the kind of casual social interactions that required the assumption of safety, of normalcy, of a world where the past stayed buried and didn't reach forward to destroy futures. Her father had lived without those assumptions, had spent 23 years looking over his shoulder, checking faces in crowds, maintaining the kind of constant awareness that exhausted you down to your bones, and he'd done it alone, without the comfort of family or the relief of connection, because connecting meant risk, and risk meant danger, and danger meant his daughter might pay the price for his choices. She needed to talk to her mother, needed to confront the woman who'd let her spend 23 years hating an innocent man, who'd chosen convenient fiction over complicated truth, who'd poisoned Rebecca's memories of her father with bitterness that now seemed like betrayal. She pulled out her phone and called the number, listened to it ring 4 times before her mother's voice came through, tentative and careful the way it always was when Rebecca called, as if she expected bad news or criticism or the particular tension that had characterized their relationship. Since Rebecca had been old enough to ask questions, her mother refused to answer. Rebecca said she was at her father's loft, said she'd found things her mother needed to explain, and the silence that followed was so long and so heavy that Rebecca thought the connection had dropped. But then her mother said, in a voice like breaking glass, that she'd be there in 20 minutes, and she hung up before Rebecca could say anything else. Those 20 minutes stretched like hours, and Rebecca used them to photograph the documents, to create digital copies of evidence she had the sudden superstitious fear might disappear if she didn't capture it immediately. She photographed the witness protection paperwork, the letters, the photographs her father had taken from a distance, and she texted them to her own email address, created backups of backups, because some part of her couldn't quite believe this was real, couldn't accept that her entire understanding of her childhood was being rewritten by documents pulled from a locked box in a dead man's desk. She thought about all the times she told people she didn't have a father, all the Father's Day cards she'd refused to make in elementary school, all the moments of casual cruelty she'd inflicted on a man who'd already sacrificed everything, who'd been living in exile so she could live in safety. Her mother arrived exactly 20 minutes later, looking older than Rebecca remembered from their last awkward dinner 2 months ago, grey showing at her temples and lines carved deep around her mouth. the face of a woman who'd carried secrets so long they'd become part of her structure, weight-bearing lies that held up her entire identity. Linda Hayes stood in the doorway of the loft and looked at the open desk drawer, at the metal box on the floor, at the letters spread across the hardwood, and her expression cycled through emotions too fast to catalogue before settling on something like resignation, like relief, like a prisoner who'd been waiting decades for sentencing and was almost grateful it had finally arrived. She didn't apologize, didn't explain, just walked to the windows and stood looking out at the rain that had started again, heavier now. And Rebecca waited because she'd learned in nursing that sometimes silence was the only tool that worked, that people filled quiet spaces with truth when pressure failed to extract anything but performance. Linda finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the rain, and she said that the marshals had given them a choice 23 years ago, said they could both enter witness protection with David or they could stay behind and let him disappear alone. And Linda had chosen to stay because she couldn't imagine raising a child in hiding, couldn't bear the thought of Rebecca growing up looking over her shoulder, changing identities every time someone got too curious, living without roots or history, or the kind of stable childhood every parent wants for their kid. The marshals had agreed to let them stay in Portland under their real names because Linda hadn't been involved in David's testimony, hadn't been a witness herself, wasn't considered a primary target, and they'd promised to monitor the situation, to watch for threats, to intervene if anything suggested Rebecca or Linda were in danger. But the condition, Linda said, turning from the window to face her daughter directly, was that the break had to be complete, had to be convincing, had to eliminate any indication that David Hayes still cared about his wife and daughter, because caring created vulnerability, created pressure points that could be exploited by people who understood that the best way to hurt someone wasn't through violence, but through the people they loved. The marshals had told Linda that she needed to make Rebecca believe her father had abandoned them, needed to create a narrative of indifference or cowardice or simple failure to love enough, because a daughter who hated her father wouldn't go looking for him, wouldn't accidentally reveal his location through innocent searches or questions, wouldn't create digital trails that sophisticated criminals could follow back to a witness who'd destroyed their organization. Linda had agreed because the alternative was entering protection herself, was raising Rebecca in a series of anonymous apartments in forgettable cities, was spending every day afraid that someone would recognize them, would connect them to David Hayes, despite the new names and manufactured histories, would use them to send a message that witnesses and their families weren't safe no matter what the government promised. So she'd made the choice that seemed less cruel at the time, had sacrificed David's reputation to preserve Rebecca's childhood, had let her daughter believe abandonment rather than danger. And she'd told herself for 23 years that she'd made the right decision, that anger was better than fear, that hating an absent father was healthier than loving one you could never see, could never touch, could never acknowledge existed without putting him at risk. Rebecca listened to this explanation with something like nausea building in her chest, and she asked why her mother hadn't told her the truth after she'd grown up, after she'd become an adult capable of understanding complex situations and keeping dangerous secrets. Linda looked at the floor, at the letters scattered there, at the evidence of David's vigil from a distance, and she said that by the time Rebecca was old enough to understand, the lie had calcified into something structural, had become the foundation of their relationship. And Linda had been afraid that revealing the truth would destroy whatever fragile connection they'd maintained. She said she'd convinced herself that David's absence was easier to maintain if Rebecca believed it was voluntary, that if she'd told Rebecca the truth at 18 or 21 or 25, her daughter would have wanted to find him, would have insisted on contact despite the risk, and Linda had been terrified that any communication would trigger the violence that David's testimony had been meant to prevent. But the real truth beneath the justifications, Linda admitted, was that she'd been angry too, furious that David had made choices that destroyed their family, even if those choices had been morally right, ethically necessary, the only decent option available to someone who'd witnessed murders and knew the names of killers. She'd resented him for testifying, for choosing justice over family, for not just looking the other way, like so many people did when witnessing evil meant endangering themselves. And that resentment had leaked into the stories she'd told Rebecca, had poisoned the narrative with bitterness that was about Linda's feelings more than Rebecca's protection. She'd let her daughter hate David Hayes because some part of her hated him too, hated him for being brave when cowardice would have been safer, for having principles when pragmatism would have kept their family intact, for sacrificing their happiness to prevent strangers from suffering at the hands of men who treated human life like inventory to be moved and sold and eliminated when it became inconvenient. Rebecca felt something breaking inside her, not clean like a bone, but messy like tissue tearing, like the fundamental structures that had organized her understanding of herself and her history were coming apart in ways that couldn't be repaired, only rebuilt into something different. She thought about all the times she'd introduced herself as someone whose father had left, all the identity she'd constructed around abandonment, all the relationships she'd kept shallow because she'd learned young that people left and love wasn't reliable, and depending on anyone meant setting yourself up for the particular devastation that comes when they disappear. She thought about the men she'd dated briefly and dismissed quickly, about the walls she'd built that looked like independence but were actually armor against repetition, against experiencing again the abandonment she'd felt at 6 years old, standing in the doorway watching her father leave for work and never come home. And she understood now that her entire adult life had been shaped by a lie, that the abandonment wound she'd carried for 23 years wasn't real, that her father had loved her so completely he'd been willing to let her hate him if that's what safety required. And the grief that rose in her throat wasn't for his death 3 weeks ago, but for all the years of his life that she'd wasted on anger, on bitterness, on the careful cultivation of indifference toward a man who'd been watching her from a distance, loving her from hiding, writing letters every birthday that he knew she'd never read until after he was gone, until the truth couldn't hurt anyone anymore, because the only person left to hurt was already beyond reach of further damage. Rebecca told her mother to leave, said it quietly but with enough finality that Linda didn't argue, just gathered her coat and walked to the door, and paused there as if she might say something else, might offer some additional justification or apology. But Rebecca turned her back and stared out the window until she heard the door close and her mother's footsteps receding down the hallway toward the elevator. She stood alone in her father's loft, with night fully settled over Portland and rain drumming against glass like it was trying to get in, trying to dissolve the barrier between inside and outside, between past and present, between the daughter she'd been this morning and whoever she was becoming now, that her entire history had been rewritten by documents pulled from a locked box. She couldn't stay in the loft, couldn't bear to be surrounded by her father's carefully minimized existence, by the evidence of how small he'd made his life to keep hers large and safe. So she locked the door behind her and drove through rain-slicked streets to the only place that made sense, the hospital where she worked, where crisis was normal and suffering was expected, and she could disappear into the familiar rhythms of pediatric emergency care, into the distraction of other people's pain. She checked the schedule and saw that Jamie Chen was working the overnight shift, her closest friend on staff, the one person who might understand what Rebecca was feeling, even if she couldn't fully explain it yet, even if the words hadn't formed into coherent narrative, just fragments and shock, and the particular vertigo that comes from discovering that everything you thought was solid was actually built on sand. Jamie found her in the break room at midnight, sitting with cold coffee and red eyes, and she didn't ask questions, just sat beside Rebecca on the worn couch that had absorbed 20 years of exhausted nurses' brief respites, and she waited with the particular patience of someone who worked with sick children, who understood that sometimes people needed time to gather themselves before they could speak. Rebecca told her everything in a rush that felt like confession, about the sealed drawer and the documents and the letters, about her father's testimony and the witness protection and the 23 years of silence that had been love disguised as abandonment. abandonment, and Jamie listened without interrupting, without offering the kind of meaningless comfort that made situations worse. Just presence and attention, and the occasional nod that said she was tracking the story, understanding its weight. When Rebecca finished, when the words ran out and left her hollow and trembling, Jamie said something Rebecca hadn't expected, said that her own father had disappeared when she was 8, immigrated back to Taiwan after her mother's death, and never contacted Jamie again. And she'd spent 20 years believing he'd abandoned her, just like Rebecca had believed about David Hayes. But 6 months ago, Jamie had discovered through a cousin that her father had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, had returned to Taiwan specifically to spare Jamie the burden of watching him deteriorate, had disappeared to protect her from the grief of gradual loss. And by the time Jamie learned the truth, her father was too far gone to recognize her, living in a care facility with no memory of having had a daughter, no awareness that she'd flown 8,000 miles to sit beside his bed and hold the hand of a man who looked at her like she was a stranger. Jamie said she was telling Rebecca this not to compare tragedies or suggest that anyone's pain was worse than anyone else's, but to make a point that mattered, that fathers sometimes made terrible choices from good intentions, that protection could look like abandonment if you didn't know the full story, and that Rebecca had something Jamie would never have, which was the chance to understand her father's sacrifice while his love was still tangible, still present in those letters he'd written, still evident in the way he'd organized his entire life around keeping her safe. Jamie said that yes, Rebecca's mother had lied, and yes, that lie had cost Rebecca 23 years of relationship with her father, but that rage at her mother wouldn't change the past and might poison the future, and that maybe the better choice was to focus not on what she'd lost, but on what she'd discovered. Proof that she'd been loved completely, sacrificially, by a man who'd given up everything rather than risk her safety. Rebecca wanted to argue, wanted to hold on to the anger, because anger felt cleaner than grief, more energizing than loss. But Jamie's words settled into her chest like stones, heavy and undeniable, and she understood that her friend was right, even if accepting that rightness meant letting go of the fury that had been sustaining her since she'd confronted her mother. She asked Jamie what she should do now, how she was supposed to move forward with this knowledge, how she was supposed to reconcile the father she'd hated with the father who'd actually existed. And Jamie said that maybe the first step was to stop thinking about reconciliation and start thinking about investigation, about learning who David Hayes had really been, about understanding the full story of his testimony and the men he'd helped convict, and whether any of them were still dangerous, still looking for revenge, still posing a threat that might explain why the marshals had been so adamant about complete separation. The idea crystallized into purpose, and Rebecca felt some of the paralysis that had gripped her since opening that drawer begin to loosen, replaced by the familiar comfort of having a task, a direction, a concrete action she could take when abstract grief threatened to overwhelm her. She thanked Jamie and left the hospital, drove back through rain that had finally stopped to her apartment in northeast Portland, and she spent the rest of the night on her laptop researching the 2002 federal drug trial, reading newspaper archives and court documents and sentencing records, piecing together the story her father had lived through before witness protection had erased him. The case had been massive, front-page news for months. 7 men convicted of running a drug operation that moved cocaine and heroin through Portland's port facilities, using legitimate shipping companies as cover for trafficking that the prosecution claimed had been responsible for at least 15 murders over a 5-year period. The trial had nearly collapsed when the primary witness, a logistics coordinator who'd worked in the organization, had disappeared 2 weeks before his scheduled testimony, found in the Columbia River with evidence of torture, a message to anyone else who might consider cooperation. But then a second witness had come forward, someone from inside the operation, someone who'd been present for planning meetings and money transfers and the discussions about eliminating people who posed security risks. The prosecution had protected this witness's identity with unusual ferocity, had used sealed testimony and voice modulation and screens to prevent the defendants from seeing who was destroying their organization, but the defense attorneys had still learned enough to make guesses, had still been able to narrow possibilities based on details that came out during cross-examination. Rebecca read through trial transcripts that the courthouse had digitized 5 years ago, and she found references to a witness who'd worked in warehouse logistics, who'd been present at a particular meeting in 1998, who'd had access to financial records and shipping schedules and the kinds of operational details that only someone trusted would have known. The defense had argued that this mystery witness was fabricating testimony to avoid his own prosecution, was trading lies for immunity, but the jury had clearly believed him because they'd convicted all 7 defendants on multiple counts, had sent them to prison for sentences ranging from 25 years to life. Rebecca pulled up the prisoner database for the Federal Bureau of Prisons and looked up each of the 7 men her father had helped convict, and her stomach dropped when she saw that 3 of them had been released over the past 4 years, had served their sentences and returned to whatever remained of their former lives. And she thought about what that meant for her father, whether he'd known about these releases, whether he'd been living in fear that men who'd lost decades to prison because of his testimony might come looking for revenge. She searched their names, combined with Portland, and found nothing recent. No news stories about them, no social media presence, no indication they'd returned to the city where their organization had operated. But absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence, and Rebecca felt fear beginning to crystallize in her chest, cold and sharp and undeniable. She needed to know more, needed to understand whether the danger her father had sacrificed everything to avoid was still real, or whether it had dissipated over time, whether the separation had been necessary for 23 years, or whether at some point it might have been safe for him to return, to reconnect, to reclaim some portion of the relationship he'd abandoned to protect her. She found the name of the lead prosecutor from the 2002 trial, a woman named Victoria Brennan, who'd been an assistant U.S. attorney then and was now a federal judge, and Rebecca drafted an email explaining who she was, explaining what she'd discovered, asking if Judge Brennan could provide any information about the current status of the case, about whether the men her father had testified against still posed a threat, about whether David Hayes had died maintaining a separation that might no longer have been necessary. She sent the email at 4 in the morning and didn't expect a response for days, so she was surprised when her phone rang at 9:30 with a Washington, D.C. area code, and she answered to hear a voice that was both professional and unexpectedly kind. Judge Brennan identifying herself and saying she'd received Rebecca's email and wanted to speak with her directly about her father's case. The judge explained that she'd been devastated to learn about David Hayes' death, that she'd thought about him periodically over the years, wondered how he was managing in protection, whether the sacrifice had been worth the cost, whether justice had required too much from a man who'd simply tried to do the right thing after witnessing evil. Rebecca asked the question that had been burning in her chest since she'd discovered the prisoner releases, asked whether her father's separation had been necessary for all 23 years, whether there had come a point when he might have safely reconnected with his daughter, and Judge Brennan was quiet for a long moment before answering in a voice that carried genuine regret. She said that the U.S. Marshal Service made those determinations based on threat assessments she wasn't privy to, that she didn't know what intelligence they had about the defendants or their associates, but that she could tell Rebecca something that might matter, might help her understand why her father had maintained the separation, even after some of the men he'd testified against had been released. The judge explained that 2 years ago, approximately 6 months after the first defendant had been released from federal prison, There had been an incident in Seattle. A former witness in an unrelated drug case had been murdered in his home, along with his wife and teenage daughter. Execution-style killings that bore the signature of cartel enforcement, and the prime suspect had been a man with documented ties to the organization David Hayes had helped dismantle. The case remained unsolved, technically, though everyone involved knew who was responsible, knew that it was a message about what happened to witnesses who thought time or distance or new identities could protect them from consequences. The judge said she'd thought about David Hayes when she'd heard about that case, had wondered if he'd heard about it too, if he'd understood that his decision to stay away from Rebecca wasn't just 20-year-old caution, but ongoing necessity, that the men he'd testified against hadn't forgotten, hadn't forgiven, and were still looking for opportunities to prove that cooperation had a price that compounded with interest over time. Rebecca felt something like ice spreading through her veins, and she asked Judge Brennan if she thought her father had known about the Seattle murders, if he'd understood that the danger was still real, still active, still hunting for vulnerabilities 20 years after his testimony. The judge said she couldn't know for certain, but that the marshals would have briefed him, would have used the Seattle case as justification for maintaining existing protocols, and that based on what she'd learned about David Hayes during the trial, about his fierce protectiveness toward his daughter, even as testifying destroyed their relationship, she suspected he'd welcomed that briefing, had probably been relieved to have concrete evidence that his sacrifice was still necessary, still serving its purpose, still keeping Rebecca safe from men who treated murder like problem-solving and revenge like long-term investment. Rebecca asked one more question, the one that mattered most now that her father was dead and the truth had surfaced, and 23 years of separation couldn't be undone or justified or redeemed. Was she in danger now? Did the men her father had testified against know about her? Would discovering the truth about her father's identity put her at risk the way his testimony had made her a target decades ago? Judge Brennan was quiet again, and Rebecca could hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of someone in an office making decisions about how much truth to share, how much protection to offer, how much fear was appropriate when someone had just discovered that their entire life had been shaped by violence they'd never known existed. The judge finally said that she didn't believe Rebecca was in immediate danger, that the men released from prison were under supervision and surveillance, that any indication they were planning violence would trigger intervention, but that she also couldn't promise complete safety, couldn't guarantee that discovery of David Hayes' death might not prompt someone to investigate, to search for connections, to find the daughter who'd been protected for 23 years and decide she represented unfinished business. She said that Rebecca should be careful without being paranoid, should vary her routines without upending her life, should tell the U.S. Marshal Service about finding her father's documents so they could assess whether any current threat existed. And she gave Rebecca a phone number for the Witness Protection Division, a direct line that would connect her to people who could provide actual answers rather than speculation. Rebecca thanked Judge Brennan and ended the call, and she sat in her apartment looking at the rainy Portland morning through windows that suddenly felt less like protection and more like exposure, like anyone could be watching from the street below, tracking her movements, waiting for the right moment to finish business that had started with her father's testimony 23 years ago. She thought about the Seattle murders, about the witness and his wife and his daughter who died for the crime of believing that justice was worth cooperation, that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished, that the government's promise of protection was more reliable than criminals' promise of revenge. And she understood finally completely why her father had stayed away, why he'd been willing to let her hate him rather than risk even the smallest possibility that contact might lead someone dangerous back to her, why he'd spent 23 years writing letters he never sent and taking photographs from a distance and loving her in a way that looked nothing like love, but was actually love's purest expression, the willingness to be the villain in your child's story, if that's what keeping them alive required, the acceptance that your sacrifice would never be understood or appreciated or forgiven. The choice to save someone who would never know they needed saving until you were gone, and the truth finally surfaced from the drawer you'd sealed shut with finishing nails and combination locks, and the desperate hope that someday, after you were dead and the danger had passed or at least diminished, your daughter would find what you'd hidden and understand that every moment of her believing you'd abandoned her was actually you holding her so tightly that she couldn't see your arms, couldn't feel your grip, couldn't know that you'd never let go, not for a second, not for 23 years, not even when letting go would have been easier than maintaining a love that expressed itself entirely through absence. Rebecca called the U.S. Marshal Service number Judge Brennan had given her, and after being transferred 3 times through layers of bureaucracy and security protocols, she finally reached a deputy marshal named Thomas Reeves, who said he'd been one of her father's handlers during the early years of witness protection, who'd helped David Hayes establish his new identity in Portland, who'd conducted the quarterly check-ins that protocol required for the first decade before the visits had gradually decreased to annual wellness assessments, and then in the final years to nothing more than occasional emails confirming continued safety. His voice carried the particular tone of someone who'd done this work long enough to understand its human cost, who'd watched witnesses disappear into new lives and wondered whether the protection they'd gained was worth the connections they'd lost, whether safety was adequate compensation for the systematic erasure of everything that made someone recognizably themselves. Marshal Reeves asked Rebecca to describe what she'd found in her father's loft, and she walked him through the contents of the sealed drawer, the witness protection documents, the letters, the photographs taken from a distance, and she could hear him making notes, the scratch of pen on paper that suggested official documentation, the creation of records that would outlast this conversation and become part of some file that tracked her father's legacy through the bureaucratic machinery of federal law enforcement. He asked if she'd told anyone else about the documents, if she'd shared them or posted them online or discussed them anywhere that wasn't secure, and Rebecca said she'd only told her mother and her friend Jamie, both of whom understood the sensitivity, both of whom could be trusted with information that might still carry danger even 23 years after the initial threat. The marshal was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that made Rebecca's blood run cold in her veins, said that her father had violated protocol by keeping those documents, by maintaining that evidence of his previous identity, by holding onto materials that were supposed to have been destroyed when he entered protection. Marshal Reeves explained that part of witness security was the complete severing of connections to previous life, the elimination of any physical evidence that could link the protected identity to the original person. And while he understood why David Hayes had kept those letters and photographs, had sympathy for a father trying to maintain some connection to a daughter he couldn't see, the retention of witness protection paperwork and official documents represented a security breach that put not just David but potentially Rebecca at risk if the materials were discovered by the wrong people. Rebecca felt anger rising sharp and hot in her throat, and she asked Marshal Reeves if he was actually suggesting that her father, who'd spent 23 years in exile to protect her, who'd sacrificed every meaningful relationship in his life to keep her safe, had endangered her by keeping evidence that he'd loved her, by maintaining documentation that proved he hadn't abandoned her but had been forced into separation by the same government that was now criticizing him for failing to completely erase his own history. Her voice came out louder than she'd intended, edged with fury that had been building since she'd discovered the truth, since she'd understood how thoroughly her father's life had been dismantled in the name of her protection. And Marshal Reeves let her finish, let her rage pour out into the phone connection before responding in a voice that was tired and sad and carried the weight of having this conversation too many times with too many families who'd paid prices they'd never agreed to pay. He said he wasn't criticizing her father, said that David Hayes had been one of the most courageous witnesses he'd worked with in 30 years of doing this job, that walking away from your family required a particular kind of strength that most people couldn't muster even when their lives depended on it. But he also said that the rules existed for reasons written in blood, in the bodies of witnesses who'd gotten careless or sentimental, or convinced themselves that surely enough time had passed, that surely the danger had faded, that surely one phone call or one letter or one brief visit couldn't possibly create the vulnerability that protocols were designed to prevent. He said that Rebecca's father had understood the risks better than most, had followed every other rule with meticulous precision, and the fact that he'd kept those documents despite the risk suggested just how much he'd needed them, how essential they'd been to maintaining some sense of identity, some connection to the person he'd been before witness protection had required him to become someone else entirely. Marshal Reeves asked if he could come to Portland to retrieve the documents, to secure them in a way that ensured they wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. And Rebecca felt possessiveness rise in her chest, because those letters were all she had left of her father, were the only evidence that he'd thought about her, cared about her, maintained a relationship with her, even if that relationship existed only in his mind and in handwriting on pages she'd never been meant to see until after his death. She asked what would happen to the documents if she surrendered them, whether they'd be destroyed or archived or locked away in some evidence room where no one would ever look at them again, and the marshal said honestly that he didn't know, that it would depend on threat assessment, on whether the men her father had testified against were still considered active dangers, on whether maintaining evidence of David Hayes's witness protection might somehow compromise ongoing investigations or put other witnesses at risk. Rebecca made a decision that felt reckless but necessary, told Marshal Reeves that she would consider his request but needed time to think, needed to process everything she'd learned before surrendering the only physical proof that her father had loved her, and she ended the call before he could argue or insist or deploy whatever bureaucratic pressure the marshals used to ensure compliance with protocols that protected witnesses by erasing everything that made them human. She knew she was being stubborn, possibly even dangerous to herself, but she couldn't bear the thought of those letters disappearing into government custody, of her father's voice being silenced a second time, of losing the only connection she had to the man who'd given up everything rather than let harm reach her. She spent the next 3 days photographing every document in the metal box, creating digital archives that she backed up to encrypted cloud storage and external drives that she hid in different locations, in her apartment and her locker at the hospital, and in a safety deposit box she rented at a bank across town. She read through her father's letters again and again, memorizing passages, absorbing his voice, trying to construct a complete picture of the man who'd written them from whatever anonymous apartment or temporary housing the marshals had provided during his years in protection. The letters revealed small details about his life in hiding, references to jobs he'd taken using his false identity, to friends he'd made cautiously and kept at a distance, to the loneliness that seemed to seep through certain passages like water through poorly sealed walls. One letter, written for her 18th birthday, mentioned that he'd attended her high school graduation, had stood at the back of the auditorium at Roosevelt High School wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, had watched her walk across the stage to receive her diploma, and had left before the ceremony ended because staying too long meant risk, meant someone might notice him, might remember his face from news coverage of the trial 16 years earlier, might make connections that would unravel everything he'd sacrificed to keep her safe. He wrote that she'd looked so much like her mother in that moment, cap and gown, and the particular smile she wore when she was proud of herself, and that he'd cried in his car afterwards, had sat in a grocery store parking lot 3 miles away, and wept for the daughter he couldn't approach, couldn't congratulate, couldn't wrap in the kind of embrace that fathers were supposed to give daughters on days that mattered. Rebecca traced that passage with her finger, imagining her father in that parking lot, and she thought about the graduation itself, about how she'd scanned the audience looking for him, even though she'd told herself she didn't care whether he showed up, even though she'd convinced herself that David Hayes was dead to her, was irrelevant to her achievements, was someone whose absence didn't hurt anymore because she'd learned to expect nothing from him. She remembered going home after the ceremony and crying in her room for reasons she'd told herself had nothing to do with her father, had everything to do with normal graduation emotions. But she understood now that she'd been mourning his absence even as he'd been present, had been grieving his indifference even as he'd been devastated by love he couldn't express. And the parallel nature of their suffering felt like the cruelest possible joke, like a tragedy written by someone who understood that the worst kind of pain wasn't being alone, but being separated from someone who was right there but unreachable. She found references in other letters to other events he'd attended from a distance. Her college graduation from Portland State University, where he'd watched from the top row of the Moda Center, her white coat ceremony when she'd been accepted into nursing school, even the 10K charity run she'd participated in 2 years ago to raise money for children's cancer research, where he'd stood among spectators near the finish line and cheered anonymously as she crossed with her race number pinned to her shirt, and exhaustion making her stumble slightly as she slowed to a walk. He'd been there for so many moments she'd believed he'd missed, had been present for milestones she'd assumed he didn't know about, and Rebecca felt anger and gratitude tangling together in her chest, because how dare he watch her life from hiding? How dare he know her better than she'd known herself? How dare he love her so completely while letting her believe he didn't love her at all? She decided she needed to understand more about the case that had destroyed her family, about the specific testimony her father had provided, about what exactly he'd witnessed that had made his cooperation so essential and his continued existence so dangerous. She returned to the trial transcripts, reading more carefully this time, and she found references to a meeting in September 1998, where the organization's leadership had discussed eliminating a competing distributor who was encroaching on their territory. The witness, identified only as Witness A for protection purposes, had described in detail how the discussion had unfolded, who had suggested the murder, who had volunteered to carry it out, who had provided the weapons and the transportation, and the cleanup afterwards. Witness A had testified about being present when the two murdered men, the ones whose bodies had launched the investigation that eventually brought down the entire organization, had been brought to a warehouse in St. John's, had been questioned about their operations and their connections, and had been killed with the kind of calculated violence that made even the hardened federal prosecutors visibly uncomfortable during trial testimony. The transcript noted that Witness A had become emotional during this portion of his testimony, had needed several breaks to compose himself, and Rebecca understood that her father had been in that warehouse, had seen men murdered, had been close enough to violence to provide the kind of specific detail that made juries believe beyond reasonable doubt that the defendants were guilty. She found a newspaper article from 2002, published during the trial, that quoted the lead prosecutor Victoria Brennan as saying that Witness A was a reluctant participant who found himself in an impossible situation, who made the courageous choice to come forward despite knowing the personal cost, who deserves recognition as someone who chose justice when silence would have been safer. The article speculated about Witness A's identity, mentioned that defense attorneys had suggested he was a mid-level logistics coordinator who'd been offered immunity in exchange for testimony, someone who'd been involved in the organization's operations but not in its violence, someone whose cooperation had come not from moral courage but from pragmatic self-interest when faced with potential prosecution. Rebecca wondered which version was true, whether her father had been noble witness or self-serving informant, whether his testimony had been driven by conscience or calculation. And then she realized it didn't matter, that whatever his motivation had been, the result was the same: 7 murderers convicted, a drug pipeline destroyed, and a little girl protected from the consequences of her father's decision, even if that protection had cost her a relationship with the man who'd made it. She thought about the David Hayes who'd existed before 1998 1998, before that warehouse in St. John's, before witnessing violence had forced him into impossible choices, and she wondered what kind of man he'd been then. Whether he'd been different from the careful, isolated person who'd lived in that Pearl District loft for 23 years. Whether witness protection had changed him or just revealed something that had always been there beneath the surface of normal family life. She found his pre-protection address in the witness security documents, discovered that before disappearing, he'd lived in a house in the Woodstock neighborhood, and on impulse, she drove there one afternoon after her shift at the hospital, found the address on a quiet street lined with craftsman bungalows and mature trees, and she sat in her car across from a house she'd apparently lived in until age 6, though she had no conscious memory of it. The current owners had painted it a different color, had added a garden where her father had apparently maintained just lawn, had installed solar panels that definitely hadn't been there when her family had occupied the space. But the bones of the house were the same. The porch where she'd presumably played, the driveway where her father's car had been parked, the windows that had framed a version of her life that had ended abruptly when witness protection had required her father to disappear. She got out of her car and walked to the front door, rang the bell even though she had no plan for what to say, and a woman in her 40s answered with a toddler balanced on her hip and a curious expression that suggested she wasn't used to strangers appearing on her porch on Thursday afternoons. Rebecca introduced herself awkwardly, explained that she'd lived in this house as a small child, asked if she could possibly come in for just a moment to see the space, and the woman's expression shifted from curiosity to something like sympathy, and she stepped back and gestured Rebecca inside with the easy hospitality of someone who understood that nostalgia was a reasonable motivation for odd requests. The interior had been completely remodeled, walls removed to create open-concept living, kitchen updated with stainless appliances and granite counters, hardwood floors refinished to a shine that suggested professional work rather than the scuffed surface Rebecca vaguely remembered from childhood. Nothing was familiar, nothing triggered memory or recognition, and she stood in what had been her living room, feeling foolish for expecting that returning to this space would somehow connect her to the father she'd lost twice. Once at 6 when he'd disappeared, and once at 29 when he died, before she could understand what his disappearance had actually meant. She thanked the homeowner and left quickly, drove back to her apartment feeling hollower than before, and she understood that she was looking for her father in places he no longer existed, in physical spaces that had been transformed by time and renovation and the lives of strangers who knew nothing about the family that had fractured here when witness protection had required David Hayes to become someone else entirely. And if this story is stirring something inside you, keep walking with it, because there are deeper truths still waiting to surface, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. 2 weeks after finding the documents, Rebecca received a package at her apartment, delivered by a private courier service that required signature confirmation and photo identification before handing over a padded envelope marked with an evidence tracking number and the seal of the United States Marshals Service. Inside was a letter from Marshal Thomas Reeves and a smaller sealed envelope that felt heavier than paper alone should feel. And Rebecca sat at her kitchen table with rain spattering against the windows, the familiar Portland soundtrack to every significant moment in her life. And she opened Reeves's letter first because she needed the context before confronting whatever was in that second envelope. Marshal Reeves wrote that after their phone conversation, he'd reviewed her father's complete file, including materials that had been sealed during David Hayes' lifetime, but were now accessible following his death and the discovery of protocol violations regarding retained documents. He wrote that what he'd found had changed his understanding of her father's case, had revealed details that had been kept from him during his years as David's handler, had shown that the separation between father and daughter had been even more necessary, even more protective, even more devastating than Rebecca could possibly have understood from the material she'd found in the loft. The second envelope, Reeves wrote, contained something David Hayes had given to the Marshal Service 10 years ago, with specific instructions that it only be delivered to Rebecca if two conditions were met: his death and her discovery of the truth about his witness protection. Rebecca's hands trembled as she opened the second envelope, and inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note in her father's familiar angular script that said simply, "For my daughter, when she finally knows why I had to leave. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this while I was alive. I'm sorry for so many things, but I'm not sorry for keeping you safe. Love, Dad." She hadn't seen him write the word Dad since she was 6 years old, since before he'd disappeared, and seeing it now in his handwriting made something crack open in her chest, made tears start even before she'd plugged the USB drive into her laptop and discovered what he'd left for her to find. The drive contained video files, dozens of them, dated across the 23 years since his disappearance. And Rebecca clicked on the first one, dated just 3 months after he'd entered witness protection, and her father's face appeared on screen, younger than she remembered him, haggard from stress and grief, sitting in what looked like a cheap motel room with bad lighting and thin walls. And he began speaking directly to the camera, directly to her, explaining what had happened, why he'd left, what he'd witnessed, and what testifying had cost him. He told her about working as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company in 1998, about how he'd been good at his job, efficient and reliable, and about how he'd gradually realized that some of the containers he was tracking contained more than the electronics and textiles listed on manifests. He told her about the meeting in September 1998, about being called to a warehouse in St. John's to help coordinate a shipment, about arriving to find 2 men bound and bleeding, about understanding too late that he'd been brought there not for logistics, but as a test, to see if he could be trusted, to determine if he had the stomach to be part of something much darker than shipping coordination. His voice broke as he described what had happened next, how the organization's leadership had questioned the 2 men, had tortured them for information about competing operations, and had finally killed them while David Hayes stood frozen in a corner, too terrified to move or speak or do anything except witness violence that would replay in his nightmares for the rest of his life. He said he'd left that warehouse covered in other men's blood, had gone home to his wife and 6-year-old daughter and pretended everything was normal, even though he knew that normal had ended the moment he'd understood what the organization he worked for actually did, what they were capable of, what they expected from people who'd seen too much. He told her about the weeks that followed, about trying to quit and being told that leaving wasn't an option, that people who knew what he knew didn't get to just walk away, that his family's safety depended on his continued cooperation and his absolute silence about what he'd witnessed. He told her about lying awake at night next to her mother, about checking on 6-year-old Rebecca sleeping in her bedroom, about understanding that his daughter was leverage, was a pressure point, was the thing the organization would use to ensure his compliance if he ever considered talking to police or federal agents or anyone who might disrupt their operations. The video files progressed chronologically, and Rebecca watched her father age across 23 years of recordings, watched his face change from young and devastated to middle-aged and resigned to old and dying, watched him speak to her from hiding, from witness protection, from the life he'd built in the ruins of the life he'd lost. He told her about finally going to the FBI 6 months after the warehouse murders, about wearing a wire to meetings, about gathering evidence while terrified that someone would notice his nervousness, would suspect his loyalty, would decide that he represented a risk that needed eliminating. He told her about the morning federal agents had come to their house in Woodstock, about how they'd explained that the organization had learned there was an informant, didn't know who yet, but were investigating, and that David Hayes and his family needed to enter protection immediately, or accept that they had maybe days or weeks before violence found them. He told her about the choice her mother had made, about Linda refusing to enter protection, about her insistence that Rebecca needed stable childhood more than she needed a father who'd be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life. And David's voice carried so much pain as he described agreeing to the separation separation, agreeing that Rebecca would be safer believing abandonment than understanding danger, agreeing to become the villain in his daughter's story because being hated was better than being mourned. He said he'd argued at first, had insisted there must be some way to maintain contact, but that the marshals had shown him the statistics, had explained that witnesses with ongoing family connections were 17 times more likely to be discovered than witnesses who severed ties completely, and that every phone call and every letter and every moment of contact created digital trails and paper evidence and opportunities for sophisticated criminals to locate people who'd thought themselves safely hidden. In a video dated on her 16th birthday, her father told her about the Seattle murders that Judge Brennan had mentioned, about the witness and his family who'd been killed because the witness had secretly maintained email contact with his elderly mother, had created vulnerability that patient criminals had eventually exploited. David Hayes said he'd heard about that case and had understood that his decision to stay away from Rebecca hadn't been paranoia or excessive caution, but the only responsible choice, the only way to ensure that his testimony didn't end up getting his daughter killed the way that Seattle witnesses' testimony had gotten his daughter killed. He said he hoped Rebecca would understand, would forgive him, would recognize that love sometimes looked like absence, that protection sometimes required cruelty, that keeping someone safe might mean letting them hate you for the rest of your life. The final video was dated 3 months before his death, and her father looked terrible, gaunt from illness and pain medication, his voice weaker but still determined, still focused on making sure Rebecca understood. He said his heart was failing, that the doctors had given him 6 months maximum, and that he'd decided to keep the documents and the letters because he couldn't bear the thought of dying without her knowing the truth, without her understanding that every day of silence had been sacrifice rather than indifference. He said he'd arranged for Marshal Reeves to deliver these videos after his death, after Rebecca had found the materials in his desk, because he wanted her to see his face, as he explained, wanted her to hear his voice telling her directly that she'd been loved completely, sacrificially, desperately by a father who'd given up everything except the hope that someday she'd discover what he'd hidden and understand that abandonment was sometimes love's most complete expression. He told her he was proud of her, proud of the nurse she'd become, proud of her choice to help children, proud of the way she'd built a life focused on service and compassion, despite growing up believing her father had valued neither. He said he'd watched her from a distance as much as he'd dared, had attended her graduations and her charity runs, and had once even sat in the hospital cafeteria drinking bad coffee while she was upstairs on the pediatric floor, just so he could be in the same building as his daughter for 20 minutes, just so he could breathe the same air and feel slightly less separated from the person he loved most in the world. He ended the final video by saying that his life had been worth living because his testimony had stopped criminals who would have hurt more people, had prevented more murders, had made the world incrementally safer, even if the cost had been steep. He said he'd made peace with his choices, with the loneliness and the separation and the daughter who'd hated him, because peace didn't require happiness, just the knowledge that you'd done what was necessary even when necessary things broke your heart. He said he hoped Rebecca would use the small inheritance he'd left her, the life insurance policy and the loft and the few possessions he'd accumulated to build something good, something meaningful, something that honored his sacrifice by being the life he'd wanted for her all along, free from fear, safe from violence, rich with the particular security that comes from knowing someone loved you enough to disappear rather than let harm reach you. Rebecca watched all the videos twice, then a third time, absorbing her father's voice, learning his mannerisms, understanding through his explanations exactly how much he'd given up and exactly why he'd given it up and exactly how much it had cost him to maintain the separation that had kept her alive. She thought about the versions of love she'd believed in before finding that sealed drawer, about how she'd assumed love required presence and communication, and the kinds of ordinary interactions that built relationships through accumulated time. And she understood now that love was actually much stranger and much larger than she'd imagined, that it could express itself through absence as completely as through embrace, that the deepest love might be the love that required its own erasure, that asked nothing in return except the safety of the person being loved. She called Marshal Reeves and told him he could come collect the documents from her father's desk, told him she'd made copies but would surrender the originals for whatever security protocols required. And when he arrived 3 days later with another marshal and proper evidence bags and chain of custody forms, Rebecca handed over the metal box and the letters and the photographs, but kept the USB drive with her father's videos. And Reeves looked at her with understanding and didn't ask, didn't insist, just acknowledged that some evidence mattered more as memory than as official record. Before Reeves left, Rebecca asked him one final question, asked if he thought her father had been happy in witness protection, if the sacrifice had destroyed him, or if he'd found some way to build a life worth living despite the loneliness and separation. The marshal was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that David Hayes had been the saddest person he'd ever known, but also possibly the most content, that he'd seemed to carry both grief and peace simultaneously, that he'd been devastated by what he'd lost, but satisfied by what his loss had protected. Reeves said that some people spent their entire lives wondering if they mattered, if their existence made any difference, if they'd leave the world better than they'd found it, but that David Hayes had never needed to wonder because he'd known with absolute certainty that his choices had saved his daughter's life, and that knowledge had sustained him through 23 years of isolation that would have broken weaker people into nothing. Spring arrived in Portland with the kind of luminous softness that made winter's darkness seem like something from another lifetime. Cherry blossoms opening along the waterfront and tulips pushing through soil in the community garden near Rebecca's apartment, and she found herself thinking about beginnings, about how life kept insisting on renewal even when grief suggested that nothing should bloom again, that the world should stay grey and dormant out of respect for what had been lost. She'd taken a week off from the hospital, her first real vacation in 3 years, and she'd spent it in her father's loft, sorting through his possessions with a tenderness that would have seemed impossible 6 weeks ago when she'd first broken open that sealed drawer and discovered that her entire history had been built on protective lies. She'd decided to keep the loft rather than sell it, had moved some of her own belongings into the space, had begun transforming it from the sparse bachelor apartment her father had maintained into something warmer, more lived in, a place where she could feel his presence without being overwhelmed by the evidence of his loneliness. She'd hung his photographs of her on the brick wall, all those images he'd taken from a distance over 23 years, and she'd arranged them chronologically so they told a story of her growing up, of a daughter maturing while her father watched from hiding. And sometimes she stood in front of that wall and cried for what they'd lost, and sometimes she smiled at the evidence of how much he'd loved her. And gradually the grief was transforming into something else. Something that felt almost like gratitude. She'd started the foundation in April, filed paperwork establishing the David Hayes Witness Support Fund, an organization dedicated to helping the families of witnesses in protection, providing counseling and financial assistance and advocacy for people whose lives had been disrupted by someone else's courage to testify against criminals. She'd endowed it with the money from her father's life insurance policy and the proceeds from selling his design business to a former client who'd offered a generous price. And she'd recruited Jamie Chen to serve on the board along with Judge Victoria Brennan, who'd agreed enthusiastically when Rebecca had called to tell her about the plan. The foundation wouldn't undo what her family had lost, couldn't restore the 23 years of separation, but it would honor her father's sacrifice by helping others navigate the particular devastation that came from choosing justice when injustice would have been safer. She'd met with her mother twice since discovering the truth. Difficult conversations in coffee shops where they'd circled around hurt and anger and the question of whether Linda's choice to hide the real story had been protection or betrayal. Rebecca still hadn't decided, still felt the anger burning beneath attempts at understanding, but she'd recognized that staying angry at her mother wouldn't change the past and might poison the limited future they had left together. And so she'd chosen something between forgiveness and acceptance, acknowledging that Linda had made impossible choices with incomplete information and more fear than wisdom. They weren't close, might never be close the way mothers and daughters were supposed to be, but they were talking, were trying, were slowly building something that looked less like family and more like two people who'd survived the same disaster and were attempting to help each other through its aftermath. Rebecca had been invited to speak at a federal law enforcement conference about witness protection and family trauma, and she'd stood in front of a room full of marshals and prosecutors and FBI agents and told them her father's story, told them about the sealed drawer and the letters and the videos, told them that protocols designed to protect witnesses sometimes destroyed the very things that made those witnesses human, that made their sacrifices sustainable, that kept them connected to reasons for living beyond simple survival. She'd told them that she understood the necessity of separation, recognized that her father's distance had kept her alive, but that maybe there were ways to maintain safety while also maintaining some thread of connection, some acknowledgement that love didn't have to be completely erased to be protected, that fathers should be allowed to let their daughters know they were still loved even if they couldn't explain why they'd disappeared. Some of the marshals had been defensive, had cited statistics about witness mortality and the dangers of any contact, but others had listened with expressions that suggested they'd been thinking about these questions too, had been wondering if the protocols they enforced were too absolute, too punishing, too focused on physical safety while ignoring the emotional devastation that came from complete familial erasure. One marshal had approached Rebecca after the panel discussion and told her quietly that he'd handled a witness case 5 years ago where the witness had committed suicide after 3 years in protection, had left a note saying that surviving wasn't worth it if survival meant losing everyone who made survival meaningful, and that the marshal thought about that case every time he enforced separation protocols, wondered if there was a better way, wondered if saving witnesses' lives while destroying their reasons for living was actually success or just a different kind of failure. Rebecca had started attending a support group for families of witnesses, a small gathering that met monthly in a church basement in southeast Portland. And she discovered that her story wasn't unique, that witness protection left behind a trail of confused children and angry spouses and parents who'd lost their kids to bureaucratic decisions about acceptable risk. She listened to a woman whose son had testified against gang members and disappeared into protection 15 years ago, who received birthday cards once a year with no return address and handwriting she could barely recognize as her son's, who spent every day wondering if he was alive or dead or simply gone in the particular way that witness protection made people gone, erased but not dead, absent but not deceased, somewhere but unreachable. She'd listened to a man whose daughter had witnessed a murder and entered protection at 19, who'd missed her wedding and the births of her 3 children, and who existed now only as a voice on occasional phone calls, placed from numbers that changed every few months. And Rebecca had understood that her father's story was part of a much larger pattern, that justice required sacrifices that the justice system rarely acknowledged, that keeping society safe meant destroying individual families. With a systematic thoroughness that would be unconscionable if its necessity wasn't so absolute. On the anniversary of her father's death, Rebecca drove to the cemetery where he'd been buried under his witness protection identity, the name that appeared on his driver's license and his lease, and his death certificate. And she'd arranged for a second marker to be placed beside the official headstone, one that read, "David Michael Hayes, beloved father, who sacrificed everything to keep his daughter safe, 1970-2024. The cemetery administrator had initially objected, had said that multiple markers for a single grave violated policy. But Rebecca had explained the situation, and the administrator had made an exception, had acknowledged that sometimes policy needed to bend for stories that couldn't be contained by normal categories. She stood at the grave, with flowers from the Pike Place market, tulips and daffodils in the colors she remembered from childhood. And she spoke to her father the way she wished she'd been able to speak to him in life, told him about the foundation and the support group, and the slow transformation of grief into something that felt almost like purpose. She told him she understood now, told him she forgave him for the years of silence, told him that she wished desperately that he'd lived long enough to see her discover the truth, to hear her say that she loved him, that she'd always loved him even when she'd thought she hated him, that the little girl who'd watched him leave at 6 years old had never stopped hoping he'd come back, even when she'd convinced herself that she didn't care whether he did. She told him about the videos, about watching his face age across 23 recordings, about hearing his voice explain what he'd witnessed and what he'd testified to and what his testimony had cost. And she said that she was proud of him, proud of his courage and his sacrifice and his absolute devotion to keeping her safe, even when that safety required becoming the villain in her story. She said that she finally understood what he'd written in that cryptic note the attorney had given her, about understanding when the time was right, and that the time had been right, that she'd found what he'd hidden, that his plan had worked exactly as he'd intended, and that she was going to spend the rest of her life honoring his sacrifice by being the person he'd died protecting, by building something meaningful with the security his absence had provided, by loving fiercely and choosing bravely, and never forgetting that sometimes the people who seem to abandon us are actually holding us closer than anyone else ever could, holding us so tightly that we can't see their arms, can't feel their grip, can't know that they never let go, not for a second, not for 23 years, not even now in death when his love had finally found its way from hiding back to the daughter who'd been waiting, without knowing she was waiting for exactly this revelation, exactly this devastating proof. That she'd been cherished all along. Before you go, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, because each week a new hidden truth rises to the surface, and I want you with me for every twist.